The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. There's Mr. Marx himself. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decreed as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. Communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power, and two, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale at the spectre of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. So Marx is here calling communism a spectre. That means that it is a vision and that it's haunting everybody across Europe. It's something that's coming in, and it seems as if it's a dark cloud to its opponents. And its opponents are anybody who's in power. And he says that, number one, that acknowledges that communism does have power and that it's time that the communists explicitly explain what they stand for. And that's what the manifesto is about. This is Marx and Engels. Engels was a benefactor to Marx. He financed his studies, his academic career, all of his writings. So did Marx ever work? Well, he definitely wasn't working in a factory. He wasn't part of the working class. The bourgeoisie and the proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves, and in the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possess, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes, directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The bourgeoisie is the middle class he's referring to. It's almost to say the upper class, and the bourgeoisie was sort of born out of the Industrial Revolution. It was the fruits of being able to make a lot more money due to being able to make products faster with industrialization. So this group benefited from the rise in national incomes that came with industry. They were people like bankers, merchants, people with shops, money men, factory owners, and they could afford to buy all of the new goods that were being produced in factories. The poor workers looked at the bourgeoisie as a separate social group from them. They were people that they would never expect to hang out with, play sports with, marry, or even be friends. And the working class, which are the poorer workers, the laborers, they're referred to as the proletariat. And the urban proletariat because of the migration of so many people from the country into the cities looking for jobs. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, that thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant, modern industry, the place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its time, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. So let's think about today, the number one enemy of man, CO2. And CO2 is a chemical produced, not only that we breathe it out and we need it for life on Earth, but it is a chemical produced out of industry. And that's a political tie. That's where the environmental movement was hijacked by Marxist groups to bring down capitalism through demonizing CO2. Even if man had some influence on the climate changing, there's probably 100 factors in the environment that cause climate change. Why have they only focused on one? So it's very limited focus, and I believe it's attached to industry, bringing down industry, because industry is capitalism. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied, by the way, he is a member of the bourgeoisie. He doesn't own anything, but he's supported by Engels, whose father was a textile magnate. He owned manufacturing factories in England, producing cotton and fabric, and Marx would never visit the factory. Engels invited him, come and see the working class. He would never even go. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervour, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless and indefeasible chartered freedoms, set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. So he seems to, unconscionable, it's just very much the enemy to him, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. Naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation, honoured and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage labourers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. It has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigour in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been, I would regard him as slothfully indolent, and has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing the Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. Well, let's just have a look at that. The bourgeoisie, the middle class, business owners, cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. That seems to be true. That means technology. It just keeps getting bigger and better to be able to produce more or to create new markets. The strange thing today is that, in my belief, those new markets are being produced by Marxists. For example, renewable energy. Whether it's a good thing or not is something to put aside, renewable energy. Pollution is not good, but is that pollution really changing the climate? That's debatable. I don't care if someone tells me that that's scientific fact, because I don't trust the scientists giving me the facts, because they can be paid off. The man of science, he's paid. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest places. Industries whose products are consumed, not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe, in place of the old wants satisfied by the productions of the country. We find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. Well, we can say that's true. That is the world expansion that happened, and it connected countries to each other. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations, and as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Each country became known to each other, and having dependence on each other for particular things eliminates a lot of trouble between nations, because you depend on each other. You need to keep the relation strong. So what he's saying is true. It's just not necessarily a bad thing. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world afar from its own image. Well, who is he to say what the image of the world is? The world is what it is. The world is not, according to Marx. People wanted to spread, and he's totally ignoring, because he doesn't believe in God and he's against religion, he's totally ignoring the genuine intention to spread Christianity to the four corners of the earth. That's what the Bible says, and that's what the Bible tells us to do. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. So just listen to what he says there, and here he apparently speaks for all communists. It has created enormous cities. That's true. People migrated to the city for work and rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. That means the complete stupidity and uselessness and ridiculousness. So it just shows you how arrogant Marx is, that he could claim that rural life, just when you think he's kind of defending rural life and defending that natural way of living that shouldn't have been disturbed by capitalism, he refers to people of rural life as being rescued from the sheer stupidity of their life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? We see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. For many a decade, past the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and, above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, the lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants. All these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. What he's saying is true. Just because what he's saying here about industry is true, it doesn't mean that the capitalist system has to be completely overthrown violently. The proletariat goes through with various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operatives of a trade. in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass, scattered over the whole country and broken up by their mutual competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is moreover yet, for a time, able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy. Okay, so far, so good. He has explained the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, and basically a history of the expansion of markets and capitalism that dominates the world and the effects of that. So moving on now to section 2, the proletarians and the communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of all nationality. So they're a worldwide movement. Number 2, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of the march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. So that would be to say that they feel capable of orchestrating the movement of the working class. They don't believe the working class parties separately can achieve their goals. The immediate aim of the communist is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. Let's just read that again. The theoretical conclusions of the communists, which is this very document and a volume of other work, right? It's theoretical because there are no communist countries at that time. There are no socialist countries, and you need to be socialist to become communist. So it is in theory, and he is saying they are no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer, which he is. He is that wannabe universal reformer, and these are his theories, and he did invent and discover them. But that's just my take on it. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property, generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. So this means private ownership. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. So let's stop for a second there. This means that Marx believes that no individual has the right to own property. Think about where we are beginning to see this in society. Squatters' rights, states that are enforcing laws that protect squatters and work against owners. Look at which state you're in and look at the laws on squatting. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. This is the heart of the problem, and please stay with me to the end of this book to really see the outline of the intentions of communists, and, as we can call them, Marxists. And that this is the seed out of which neo-Marxism and neo-communism and woke capitalism has sprung from, to really look underneath at what's going on when you've got this facade of wanting to do good. And a lot of people do want to do good. I mean, most people in the world want to do good, but we have to be realistic. You can't live in a fantasy land. And it's funny that being a Christian, people think we live in a fantasy land. People call it the fairy in the sky and all these sorts of insults. But we're talking about supernatural. Christians are talking about supernatural utopia. We're talking about when Jesus comes back. That is promised, that he has defeated evil. But we are told the reality of this life on earth, that there will always be poor, that injustice will always go on. It doesn't mean you don't fight for justice. That's why we have laws. That's why God gave us a law to follow. But we're under no illusion that man can create a perfect system when man is not perfect. You need a perfect person to create a perfect system. And Jesus was that person, born of the Holy Spirit of God. I mean, this is different to creating some political system. This is why the church and the state are separate. People think today that the church and state are separate to protect the state from religion, but it's the opposite. Real Christianity can never be the state. The laws and the spirit of the law written in the Bible can be expressed through political expression. I'm expressing it right now. I'm trying to tell people to look behind what Marxism and communism really stands for. And ultimately, that this man, Marx, through being an atheist and being anti-God and anti-Christian, he developed his own form of religion. And that is what Marxism is. It's a religion for people who don't have a traditional religion. So I'll just read that again, because really think about it. Do you want the abolition of private property? Do you want nobody to own anything? You have to look at things when they sound good on the outside, and you can find good reasons for that to sound good. But the person who owns everything has all the control, and that is true. And this can come down to you don't own the clothing that you wear. You don't own the computer that you're on. You own nothing. Now, not owning anything means you didn't have to pay for anything, but it also means you don't have the choice as to what you own. The state distributes it. You think the state's going to give you the best quality iPhone, or do you think they're going to give you a generic standard phone? So you lose individual freedom. So let's read on. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. He reiterates, we communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. So property, you think of housing. But property is your watch. Property is the pen you're writing with. Property is your coffee cup. It's anything you own. And yes, some people have more than others, but if everybody is distributed equally, everybody is going to have the lowest form of property. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has, to a great extent, already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. And he blames capitalism for already having destroyed it. Then he says, or do you mean modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, that is, that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property, in its present form, is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal, but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not a personal, it is a social power. Well, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society. Personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite in bare existence as a laborer. What therefore the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only in so far as the interest of the ruling class requires it. But the Communist Party themselves are going to not allow the worker to earn any more than he needs to live. So they are also, in my interpretation, oppressing the worker. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. These are the types of paragraphs where Marx, to me, is just doing his intellectual con job. In bourgeois society, a laborer is a means to increase accumulated labor. I'm not going to move past it till I get it. In bourgeois society, meaning that there's a boss, there's an owner of, say, a factory, the living labor, which is the man who labors, is a means to increase labor. Right. So the business owner wants to increase the business, sell more products, and hire more people. I guess that's what that means. In communist society, accumulated labor, so they're still going to do the same thing. They're going to increase the amount of labor to increase production and increase the amount of income for the country, is a means to enrich the existence of the laborer. So let's just say they're both making the same amount of money. Both systems, in the bourgeois society, the business owner only has to take care of the laborer, not the entire country or state. In a communist society, the laborer's work and the profit that comes from it, he claims he will enrich the laborer, but also with that money has to look after the entire society because it's a government versus a private business. In bourgeois society, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. By freedom is meant under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling, and buying. So he wants to abolish all of that. The Communist Party wants to abolish free trade, free selling and buying. If selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all the other brave words of our bourgeoisie about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying, with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeoisie conditions of production and of the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. It goes on, you reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent into a social power capable of being monopolized, that is, from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you say, individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Do you see the extremity of this? That's a whole class of people that he's judging as a certain type of monster that must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. But I digress. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. Let's read that again. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is deprive him of the power to use the labor of others by means of such appropriation. So he can't employ anybody. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. All objections urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communistic modes of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as, to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. Let's just move on here down to the selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. Here we see another common concept put forward through the United Nations and filtering all the way down through every leftist institution is the abolition of the family, the abolition of the nuclear family. We've seen this happening throughout the last few decades, and it's been successful. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanquishing of capital. I mean, come on, you got to admit this is crazy. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you will say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education, is not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools? The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. But then the communists become the ruling class. Do you see where it's going? The oppressed becomes the oppressor. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed co-relation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more, by the action of modern industry, all family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. In socialism, the state becomes everything. No God is allowed. Mankind is it. And with the family, it's almost as if it will want to split apart the family so that those loyalty connections won't anchor you to anything. Let's read on and see what more it may say about that. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the whole bourgeois in chorus. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production, the very seed of feminism, that we are more than just mothers, instruments of production. Well, of course, but it depends how highly you rank being an instrument of production, being a mother. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the community of women, which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having the wives and daughters of the proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Well, that's interesting that he claims the middle class and entrepreneurs are more prone to that than working class people. Apparently he himself lived in a menage a trois. So yeah, maybe he knew about the bourgeoisie because he was part of the bourgeoisie. So he would have actually been overthrown by his own party. But of course, the people who are in charge of these systems of socialism, they're always exempt from their own rules and laws. When they create censorship, it only applies to everybody else, not themselves. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common. And thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system of prostitution, both public and private. The communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take them from what they have not got. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. Do you get this, guys? To tell you that the working class have no country, that's his opinion. That's his philosophy. That's the Communist Party's outlook. You have no country. Because when you have allegiance to your country, for example, Australia, Canada, USA, whatever it may be, that's a certain loyalty. That patriotism is a loyalty to something that unites everyone in the country. And the communists can't have that. They can't have you united with other class groups. They have to have you divided and loyal to them and loyal to the goal and the mission of overthrowing that very system and being in complete division with your neighbor if your neighbor is not for your cause. It's completely divisive of national patriotism, and patriotism has a beautiful role. It unites the people within one border. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, you can have your mind remain open to different loyalties, but that particular loyalty and the unifying quality of that is really useful to maintaining peace in a society. And just this part here, because this just shows the utter lack of reality that the Communist Party faces. That because they are anti-God, they have no intrinsic understanding of the human nature of man, and that we are imperfect, that we're flawed. And so therefore, no system will be without flaw. But without the intrinsic knowledge of the values of Christianity, which is that human nature is flawed, and that's why the democratic capitalist system, it was built around those flaws with the separations of power. And because Judeo-Christian people created the system that we have now, they factored human nature into the system. This guy doesn't do that. So we'll just keep reading to just reiterate where he's coming from. But he's the one here saying hostility of one nation to another will come to an end when the exploitation of one individual by another is put to an end. But also, how unrealistic is that? You know, even if we're all distributed evenly, the next door neighbor who's not honest is going to come and try and get yours, because he might even want to go sell that extra loaf of bread and make himself some. Come on. This is what humans do. Some humans don't do that, but there are always people in society that do that. They're everywhere. We see that. It's not a delusion, it's reality. The charges against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint, which is every standpoint that he's basically summing up there, are not deserving of serious examination. Do you hear this guy? This is where Vogelin goes into detail about Marx being an intellectual swindler, about him being a con man, intellectual con man, through the many ways in which he says, do not question me, do not present argument to me. This is what he says here, are not deserving of serious examination. Let's read on and see in a little bit more detail what he means by that. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? Does that require deep intuition to comprehend? It takes deep intuition to discredit. Generally, yeah. Let's say I'm poor and I'm in prison. I'm being treated like crap. My consciousness, my belief in God, I'm still going to have that belief, but I'm going to be a bit angry, like, damn, I don't want to go through this. It's going to be physically horrible. But spiritually, your consciousness is not really going to change. Your ideas, your views, your conceptions, they're not necessarily going to change. It depends. It depends on the person and the person's life. It's individual. What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. Okay, I can totally discredit that one. The Christians were the lowliest. They were Jews. They were under Roman occupation. They were at a terrible time in their history. In no way were they the ruling class. Yet their ideas came to rule within 300 years. That was not from material production or intellectual production. That was through spiritual production, and that led to them having intellectual production. When people speak of ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact that within the old society, the elements of a new one have been created. And in that dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religion, liberty, and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survived this change. There are, besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society, but communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. And this is where communism is not based on reality. Because reality is our historical experience. And that's just the truth. We can't create out of thin air a new reality. Reality has been presented to us. It can evolve, it can change, but some fundamental truths, as he says, eternal truths, can't be abolished. But yet he says communism abolishes eternal truths and acts in contradiction to all past history. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. Do we see that today? A complete breakdown of traditional ideas? And I understand the appeal of that. You're like, oh, well, that's not really working, so let's create something new. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. So he goes on to say, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat, organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. And this is where you see the oppressed become the oppressor. Anywhere else you can think of that we might have seen that recently? Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will of course be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Number 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number 3. This might excite you. Abolition of all right of inheritance. Sorry, your mum and dad worked the whole life for their money and they want to leave it to you? They can't. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Confiscation. That means stealing. 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Does that sound familiar? CBDCs, anybody? I guess they're still working towards that. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Improving the soil is good. 8, equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the population over the country. So that's pretty much they're going to force you to live where they need you to live. Send you out to the farm. 10, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production. When, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and, as such, sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms, and of classes generally, and will therefore have abolished its own supremacy as a class. And then, in place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms organisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So this photo here shows and says immediately after the Cologne Communist trial of 1852, the Communist League disbanded itself. Communism is a worldwide movement. It's a movement that wants the whole world to run like that. As we saw here, this was multiple countries. So it was always under pressure because of the very things I've spelt out to you and that Marx spelt out to us. The third section and the final section, thank you if you've stayed with me this long. Section 3, Socialist and Communist Literature, Reactionary Socialism, Feudal Socialism. So I won't read the entirety of this, but it is just basically where the bourgeoisie wanted to overthrow the feudal system. So the feudalists decided to try and collaborate with the working class to create a sort of feudal socialism, but the workers didn't really go for it. It didn't really work. And the bourgeoisie were still considered the blame. So just starting down the bottom left. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism that their chief accusation against the bourgeoisie, this is the feudalists, amounts to this, that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed, which is destined to cut up root and branch the old order of society. What they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat, as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat, according to Marx. In political practice, therefore, they join in all coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their highfalutin praises, they stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry, to barter truth, love, and honour for traffic in wool, beetroot sugar, and potato spirits. As the person has ever gone hand in hand with a landlord, so has clerical socialism with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. Has not Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burnings of the aristocrat. So Christianity does believe in charity. It does believe in, it doesn't necessarily, it's not to say with poverty that you have to be poor. It's just that if you are poor, that you can still realize your value. Under Christ, everyone is equal, spiritually, not necessarily monetarily. Celibacy, well, that is unique to Catholicism. Priests were celibate. Priests did not have ownership of property, and they didn't have children to pass the inheritance down to. So the rules of the Catholic Church, yes, they prevented the priest from ownership so that they could take all of the wealth of the priest or any ownership that he had. You know, that part of it, I can see his point, but he's not really grasping true Christianity. B, the petty bourgeois socialism. The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, not the only class whose conditions of existence pined and perished in the atmosphere of modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which are but little developed, industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute far more than half of the population, it was natural that writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use in their criticism of the bourgeoisie regime the standard of the peasant and petty bourgeois, and from the standpoint of these intermediate classes should take up the cudgels for the working class. Thus arose petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school, not only in France but in England. So if something is not revolutionary, as these reactionary groups are, these reactionary groups are more interested in sort of melding and blending things to kind of make everybody happy, not to overthrow anybody. So the next type is German, and he has true socialism in inverted commas because to him it's not true socialism. The Germans agreed with the French principles that were brought forward from the French Revolution. They needed to bring the French ideas into alignment with German philosophical viewpoints. The French philosophy didn't accentuate the struggle of class, especially the working class, the proletariat, but were more interested in the overall struggle of mankind in general. So Marx disagreed with this outlook. He says the German liberal movement was against feudal aristocracy and monarchy after separating itself from French socialist philosophy. So this movement became stronger, in Marx's opinion, than the French socialist movement, and it was on the right track in Marx's mind. But he then says, by this, the long wished for opportunity was offered to true socialism of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands, of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalism. Anathema means the rejection, hatred, disgust at liberalism, representative government, against the bourgeoisie, market competition, against the freedom of the press. He is expecting this vitriol, rejection and hatred of these things, but he's not seeing that in the German socialism. He's also not seeing enough preaching to the masses that what they had to lose. So as it says, preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. So he goes on to say, it was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of floggings and bullets with which these same governments just at that time dosed the German working class risings. They're trying to appease the current government and work with it rather than overthrow it. And he says below that, while this true socialism served the governments as a weapon for fighting the bourgeoisie, at the same time it directly represented a reactionary interest of the German bourgeoisie class. He basically reiterates that to preserve the bourgeoisie class is to preserve the entire system. Ultimately, though, this petty bourgeoisie, true German socialism, wanted to preserve the petty bourgeoisie, which was incompatible with Marx's socialist communist beliefs. They still believed in eternal truths, which Marx detested. They believed in the German people and the German nation. They just wanted to incorporate socialism into that. And that went against Marx's theory, which was directly opposed to a peaceful coming to an understanding, because it had to be through brutality and destructive force. It even went to the extreme length of directly opposing the brutally destructive tendency of communism and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles. With very few exceptions, all the so-called socialist and communist publications that now circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and enervating literature. Conservative or bourgeois socialism. It was aimed at redressing social grievances, but Marx viewed this as only wishing to preserve their own existence. They were made up of economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, those who wanted to improve the conditions of the working class, charity organizations, societies for the cruelty of animals, drug and alcohol prevention groups, and just reformers of every kind. These are the socialist elements of systems we see today, and that aligns with Christianity. Christianity is based on a lot of charity and giving to those who are poor, and socialism does that too. They are very different systems, because we see with the extreme of Marxism, he's just not happy unless that bourgeoisie class, which he was part of, he did not work. He was not a worker. He lived off other people's money and he lived the high life. He was the bourgeoisie, but he demanded that that class be abolished. Nothing short of a revolutionary abolishment of that class would satisfy him. So the conservative socialist groups, they had good intentions, but they just weren't good enough for him, because they weren't interested in a revolution, especially not a violent revolution. So next we have the critical utopian socialists. Revolutionary literature of the proletariat, universal asceticism and social leveling. A little bit similar to the previous. His criticism is that the workers in this group were not organized or informed of their historical initiative. Due to this, they search for new social laws to create more favorable conditions. And essentially that's what happened. They're still evolving to this day to be improved, to always continue to help workers. The unions were established. That was all based on the working class, and it assimilated into the system. But ultimately, it didn't become a socialist country. It has a lot of socialist elements. Okay, so what really drives this home, and why I'm really against Marxism, is this. As he says here, and this is one of his objections, they want to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they habitually appeal to society at large without distinction of class. So when we have race riots and all this talk of racism, most people are sitting at home going, I'm not racist. I don't need this division. And of course, there are racists, but I think they're a minority. So the final section is the position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties, and in particular, the working class parties. So parties that would align somewhat with his ideas? As he says here, the communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the communists ally themselves with the social democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to phrases and allusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. So they're in alignment there. But what he goes on to explain about each of these different groups is that they're a watered down version of communism, and they have moved into being social democrats. So probably similar to what we see today. You know, we do have those elements of socialism, but we're not aiming to overthrow the government. Or are we? Because this is what this whole video is about. We now have some true Marxism. You can relabel it neo-Marxism. It is woke culture. It is the BLM riots. It's transgender. It's the sexual minorities. So what we have today is not the working classes being divided. We have classes through gender. We have segregated people through sexual orientation and race. Those are the three main areas where people have been divided and then choose a side. So it's different today. But you can see the underlying themes being repeated. And in other texts and other videos that I'll show you, I can show you beyond this. I just wanted to show you the seed of it all. I wanted to show you the Communist Manifesto as a serious document that, as it says right here, the communists openly declare that their ends can be attained only by forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So you see, when you have the Black Lives Matter riots, when you have the riots of Minneapolis, when you have defund the police, it's all to break down and overthrow the existing social conditions. And you have politicians who are on board with that. And you have decades of university teaching with Marxists at the helm. And this is now here. They're winning. So this is why people have stopped whatever else they're doing to make time to dedicate to this as a duty. There's plenty of Marxists. There's plenty of people who believe in this. And so the peace-loving people who don't believe in this and don't believe in forcible overthrow or seizing someone else's property or overthrowing a complete class just because they're a class and not judging people on their individual character, people who don't believe in that need to start speaking up, need to start standing against this, need to start recognizing it. And now that you have had this introductory to Marxism, you will start to recognize it, and you can take it from there because there's plenty more information out there, and I'll point you to other experts who do that much better than me. So to just read on the final words of the Communist Manifesto: let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite.